Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Facebook Live broadcast. I'm Steve Altishan, Director of Client Partnerships here at Pacific Cascade Legal. And today I'm here with Dr. Tamara Soles to talk about supporting your twice exceptional child. Hey, Tara, I would say Tamara, how are you doing today?
I'm doing okay. Thanks for having me back. I'm really happy to be here.
Oh, I love it. That first one was so great. And it kind of leads into this one to a term that I would say many people have not heard before, but I hadn't really heard it before.
Yeah.
And so that's really the way also kind of what you call things in this sort of field changes at times. And so I'm assuming a lot of people maybe just don't know what we mean by twice exceptional children. Can you kind of fill us in on that?
Yes, absolutely. And you're right. It is a term that is unfamiliar to many, but twice exceptional, or sometimes also just referred to as 2E, generally means someone who has both been identified as intellectually gifted, and that's a whole conversation in and of itself of what that entails. But
Yeah.
having both intellectual giftedness as well as another identifiable neurotype or condition like ADHD or autism or a learning difference, for example, like dyslexia. So it's essentially having at least two, you know, intellectually gifted and another condition. And that's what we call as twice exceptional.
Is that common? I mean, I guess, I was kind of surprised when I was read that you can have these gifts and then have this other thing. Is that sort of neurodivergency a common thing, or is it pretty rare?
Yes. No, absolutely, it's common. In fact, the comorbidity or overlap of conditions, I would say, is more the rule than the exception.
Wow.
In so many kids, we see an unevenness to their development, even amongst gifted children. And so we may see certain areas of their functioning really excelling and above their potential peers, but also then having difficulties in other areas which can be difficult sometimes for parents and even educators to understand because it seems to be in contrast when we see them have such strong skills in one area, but they may be struggling in another area. And so it is challenging, but as a result, we do tend to see this overlap quite a bit. So it is very common.
Wow. So how, let's talk a little bit how a parent can maybe recognize that. I mean, know that. Are there like things they can see to say, oh, that the person might be twice exceptional?
I think in general, when we're parenting our kids, we're trying to understand their strengths and challenges as a whole. And that can be a particular challenge with twice exceptional children because either their intellectual potential can overshadow sometimes their other challenges, or sometimes their other challenges overshadow their intellectual potential. So, for example, you may have a student in the classroom who behaviorally, and meaning what we see in the classroom, is that they're struggling to pay attention, or they're impulsive, or they're not focused on the task at hand. And on the surface, that's behavior that we can see that a teacher might notice, and we might get feedback about that child as having those challenges or behaviors. But the work only begins there. That's what we see, and we need to understand why. And so when we can start to look more deeply into both our children's strengths and challenges, we can start to understand them better. So, for example, if a child was coming to me and the question was, why are they struggling to pay attention in class? I would be looking at classical ADHD type things, but also looking at their intellectual capacity, right? We'd be measuring their intelligence as we measure it in its, problematic at times way with the tests that we have, but that would be important information because we want to understand maybe it's not ADHD, maybe it's not twice exceptional, maybe it is just giftedness. and they're bored or they need support. So it's a big puzzle, and often it requires some expertise to try to figure it out. But I would start as a parent with just trying to understand, what are my child's strengths? What are their challenges? What are the what is the feedback I'm getting from teachers about where they maybe need support? And then get into that detective work of why that might be.
It seems like if teachers don't have some of this knowledge that of this existing and looking for it, they could overlook it. Somebody's exceptional, and you just don't bother to look at, maybe they've also got, some learning disability.
Yes, exactly. For the most part, the vast majority of teachers I work with are so wonderfully collaborative and are pretty in tune with their students. But we're also asking teachers to do the impossible a lot of times, which is to
Yeah.
really thoroughly understand a very large group of divergent children. And so it is very possible that a teacher might not be able to see what's underlying, the difficulties for a child, and might see it only as a learning disability, without necessarily digging. But hopefully, again, when teachers bring something up to a parent, because usually they're pretty good at communicating when there's challenges in the classroom, then the parent can advocate for their child and say, I wonder if we need to look more deeply into what may be going on here. And sometimes the school and the school psychologist might be able to do some of that digging. And sometimes that might be done privately or separately. But it is important that there's someone who's advocating for that child to do that digging, because often by the time there's some noticeable difference in their learning in the classroom, another thing that may happen for twice exceptional kids is that their self-esteem has also been impacted, because by their nature, they're often highly sensitive children as well.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that might get flagged early on is related to their emotion regulation. So they may struggle with regulating their emotions at school or at home. So again, this may also be something that catches a teacher's attention or a parent's attention without fully understanding why they might be having difficulties managing their emotions.
This is a goofy question. They're not, is being, intellectually gifted and maybe autistic or whatever, can they affect the other part? I mean, it's, yeah, or are they sort of there separately? And so you,
Right.
you you work on this and you work on this, or is there really a need because to get to it, because one can be hampering the other?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's not a goofy question at all. I think it's a great question, very astute. I actually, the way that I think about it is that, these things are integrated into one whole human, right? And we can't separate them out in the way that we might separate out different functions of the body. The kidney does this and the liver does that, right? The way that our brains are designed is that they work in an integrated fashion. And having a particular neurotype, including twice exceptionality, means that we move through the world with a particular lens. And so it's, if we use an analogy of sunglasses, it wouldn't be that one lens is like an autistic green and another one is an autistic, orangey hue. It's really like a layer that both, would impact. So they interact with each other and impact how a child moves through the world and sees the world.
So if I come to you and I say, well, I got a thing from my teachers and they believe that my child is twice exceptional, what do I do? How can I support this? And maybe what shouldn't I do? It seems like that would be a common question that you get.
Yes. Yes. And one thing that I will say is that there is one benefit to the online space is that many communities have been created for various, groups of individuals, including parents and including parents of neurodivergent children. It has been harder to find spaces for twice exceptional children. because they do have a unique set of needs and strengths. And so parents do often come saying, like, what do I do? Like, do I read the books on supporting an autistic child? Do I read the books on supporting a gifted child? Or do I look at this website or that website? And that is tricky because there is that overlap, as we spoke about. So, what I try to do is just shift away from that a little bit to say, let's focus on your child's unique brain and brain wiring. And what do we know about what works for them, right? Because none of these groups are a monolith. We know that certain things might be helpful for autistic individuals or might be helpful for gifted individuals, but there's so much variability within those communities as well. So, if we can really focus in on what is your child's strengths and challenges, that will help ground us and give us some feedback. It's one of the benefits of doing an assessment is if someone does an assessment, again, with the school or privately or however that is possible for them, it actually gives you very clear data on where a child is struggling and the processes in which the child may be struggling, be it with reading or certain elements of their attention or memory or visual information. So it'll give us concrete information and also clearly see where they are doing well, so we can leverage those things to support their other areas of learning. So one of the things that I love doing when working with children who have been identified as gifted or having high intellectual potential is capitalizing on their interests and being able to say, okay, let's take your interest, right? And maybe it's something that diverges a little bit from the classroom project, but let's say, how do we take this project and pull it into your sphere of interest and help you deep dive, take it deeper than where you might have otherwise? Because intrinsically, gifted individuals want to go deep and really understand something at a level that their peers may not be able to or interested in. So being able to help teachers or parents adapt work, not to just give them more or harder, but actually adapt it to their interests and their skills and say, how can you take this to the next level to make it engaging and interesting for you?
I love that. It makes me think when you say that, you know, when I was younger or when I had kids, if they were, the exceptional kids would go into the honors classes, and the kids that were kind of struggling would go into these classes. But it seems like maybe that's not necessarily the thing anymore because, what do you do if you have both?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a conundrum to say the least. And
Yeah.
I benefited myself from being in a gifted program when I was younger. And one of the things that I realized in becoming a psychologist and studying psychology, when I look back at the program, certainly I felt incredibly fortunate to have been in a program that was very different structurally from a traditional school environment. But what I also realized was that often so-called gifted kids will do well in many environments, but the kids who would have benefited most from that type of environment were kids who learned differently, um, who maybe needed more support or had ADHD or autism or learning disability. And so for these twice exceptional kids, really being creative and not just thinking it's not just about separating them for a different curriculum
Right.
or just harder. It's really about meaningful experiences, meaningful learning experiences, and deeper learning
Yeah.
experiences.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. So on your website, which, by the way, I'm going to make sure you tell everybody about because it's wonderful. You
Thank
had
you.
a little article about this, which got us interested in this. And I love the nuts and bolts things. So as soon as you pulled out, well, here are 5 strategies to support your twice exceptional children. I went, oh, okay, we got to talk about some of this. So can we just kind of go through some of the strategies? And again, like you say, not everyone works on everyone, but what are
Yeah.
some of the strategies that people can kind of, you know, try as a potential for them to
Yes.
use?
Yes. So the first one is essentially what we've been talking about, which is strength-based learning,
Yeah.
right? So it's really just leveraging those strengths and also figuring out how to, engage the whole team, be it parents, educators, and so on, to build upon their talents and strengths to implement that in their learning environment, right? We want to support their challenges, but also leverage their interests and strengths. But ultimately, my second point is really about empowering students as well, because as parents, we're not with them in the classroom every day if they're in a traditional school, right? And we want them to understand their own learning and their own learning needs. So, one of the ways that we can best support them is to help them understand their strengths and their challenges, to communicate those again in a strength based way, and for them to start reflecting on what helps you. Like, here's some strategies that we're going to try in the classroom. Tell us what helps you. Did this work? Did it make a difference? And have them be able to take that forward to, help themselves as they navigate their educational journey. Um, but my third point is that none of this is really possible if we don't have a learning environment that is nurturing and safe and where differences are celebrated, right?
Yeah.
So sometimes when we have these educational environments in which children are segregated by their abilities, right? And children have this sense of their competence or incompetence in certain areas because I'm in this group or that group, and people's strengths are not being leveraged as a whole, regardless of neurotype, then it's really hard to affect these strategies in a way that's meaningful. So being able to create learning environments where all differences are celebrated. So being able to actively seek out and create neurodivergent spaces, certainly diversity in all forms, but for the purposes of this conversation, neurodiversity in particular, making sure that these things are highlighted and that we talk about, the great strengths that come with ADHD, for example, right? And that creativity piece and the spontaneity and the thinking outside the box. And so it's not to negate the challenges that twice exceptional kids have. They have many. And as I said at the beginning, often that can be particularly challenging because they're expected to do well or expected to shine because of their intellectual potential. So for some, it is particularly challenging to be seen as having both strengths and challenges. But when we create these environments that are open to different neurotypes, then we make it safe to have all of these strategies in place and embraced.
I love that because it also seems to me like that's where you can really help a kid generate their confidence. And the more confident they become, the more, like you said, empowered they become.
That's exactly it, right? I mean, ultimately, I have a lot of feelings about education in general, but, particularly in the current state of affairs, it shouldn't be so much about telling them what to learn. It's teaching them
Yeah.
how to learn.
Yeah.
And in order to know how to learn, we have to recognize that there isn't one right way. And so twice exceptional students are going to need to know how they learn best in order to be successful going forward. And so it's so critical that we understand that there's multiple ways of learning and that we can support kids in various ways and give flexibility, right? For a student who is quite exceptional, who may be gifted and autistic, they may really struggle with presenting something orally in front of a class, for example. But if that's the only way that they're allowed to show what they know on a topic, they're going to be sort of unduly punished, if you will. So we want to, again, create those opportunities in an equal opportunity environment that's equitable for their own learning, for them to be
I
able to
love when
shine.
you talk about not being told what to learn. I remember in high school, I had a high school teacher who said, an education is what you have after you've forgotten everything you learned in school.
Ah, and it stayed
It's the
with you, right?
ability to learn. Yeah. It's
Yes,
always like that. I
yes,
like that. The
yes.
You also talk about, and you've talked about this some, is the appropriate level of challenge. That's got to be kind of hard to, at least at the beginning, kind of figure out. That one seems
Yeah,
like it's one that is not super easy just to implement.
that's right. It is not, for many reasons. And it does involve a lot of trial and error. And that's sort of part of the process. And recognizing that there's different variables other than just level of difficulty. It's the presentation of the material. Is it being read? Is it orally being presented? So there's so many variables to adjust to try to kind of figure out that it is a lot of trial and error. But hopefully we're talking about optimizing their education for their lifetime. And so, yes, if it takes us some time for some trial and error, ultimately it's in service of years, hopefully, of being able to optimize their educational environment. So it is trial and error. Sometimes, a teacher might be able to give a math, page worksheet to a student and then realize, okay, no, you're ready for more of a challenge. But maybe when it's in a worksheet format, it doesn't work as well. Maybe you need to do it actively on the computer, or you need a real life application of it, and then your math skills shine. So it is tricky to say the least. And of course, again, I'm acknowledging that when there's one teacher and 30 students, for example, it's very hard to differentiate learning. So a
Yeah.
lot of this is really rethinking how we create classrooms. But ultimately, even when we can work within a traditional classroom, we can advocate for a student to have a separate, um, you know, duotang or binder that has things that are more at their level or interest, so that if they finish their classroom work quickly, they have something else to do so that they're engaged in learning. They're not just finishing the sheet in 5 seconds and then sitting there while the whole class is still working. So even within a traditional structure, we can find even small adjustments that can be made to try to keep them engaged in learning.
Yeah. On your site, I read where you talked about your favorite high school English teacher and assigning you an
Yes,
essay. Can you talk about that a little bit? Because
yes,
that
yes,
to me was sort of oh, I sort of get this, what you're talking about.
yes. Yes, so Mr. Stapley is, one of my favorite teachers ever. And I'd had him for multiple years. And one year he had given an assignment and it was, a book study, and there was to be an essay on that book. And he came to me separately and said, no, 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 you don't get to write an essay this time. And I was shocked. And he said, no, because I know how you'll do. You'll write a great essay, you'll do fine, and you're not learning anything. He said, I want you to write a play instead. And I'm shocked. And he said, yeah, I want you to rewrite an ending and make it as a play and write that instead. And I was shocked, as I said. But number one, even as a teenager, I felt so seen because I felt like a teacher understood that it wasn't just about showing what I know, it's about learning. And that I needed something different to help me learn something new. And there wasn't a whole big discussion of like, why does she do this or this person do that? And often we get caught up in these questions of like, well, if I do this to this person, then what am I, we get caught up in the logistics, but it doesn't have to be overly complicated. And it was such a meaningful experience. And of course, I learned more from that assignment than any other assignment where I just turned out another essay, right? I flexed a new muscle, and, it was hard and it was challenging. But again, with twice exceptional kids, a challenge is motivating.
Yeah.
And it's the lack of challenge that keeps so many stuck. So
Yeah.
finding
Yeah.
that just right challenge is incredibly motivating.
I know you write about the importance, or at least working on the creating a plan, having a plan, which
Yes.
I like. And, you know, it reminds me, and maybe one day we need to do one on just this. There's these individualized education plans. And to me, they're like a light bulb. They're incomprehensible how they work. They
Yeah.
they really, and is that it seems like that needs to be is pretty important into this whole mixture is to have a good one.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I get that schools are inundated with APs and they can become sort of the rubber stamp paperwork that has to get
Yeah,
done. But it really is an opportunity to advocate for your child or your client if you're a psychologist like me, because it is absolutely the time where you get to say, this is how my child learns best. And here's what you as a school, as an educational institution, obligated by law to provide in order to meet my child's learning needs. And so that is absolutely your opportunity. And once it's in writing, in the IEP, that's your, grounding, that's your
yeah,
document to save you. So a good one is critical. And I encourage parents to take an advocate with them, even if it's just a friend, somebody who can advocate, who knows your child well, even if you don't have access to another professional, take somebody with you so that you don't feel railroaded by a bunch of,
yeah.
people. Be able to advocate for your child. But an IEP is critical. And there's also great resources online about what makes a good IEP. So you can do some research also on terms like strength-based IEPs, for example,
Right.
and look up what makes a good IEP.
Well, we are almost out of time, but this whole leads around to again, um, you and the kind of and I want to kind of come back and touch about. So if I come in, I mean, uh, to talk to you, what is your and the people like you role in this?
Yes, it's a great question. So it really depends on what a family needs. It can be anything as simple as I just need a consultation to better understand how I can advocate for my child at school, or how to just massage some strategies at home or school to better suit my child's needs. Or it could be something more thorough, like a full evaluation, where we're looking at identifying, is your child's voice exceptional? What are the various conditions that your child may have that affect how they learn? Or therapy, for example, is also an option. So for a child who may be struggling with the challenges, as I said, maybe self-esteem that come from being underestimated or overestimated and not being recognized as having challenges as well. So
Yeah.
there's various ways we can be supportive. Um, but there's also school psychologists in schools that can do that as well. So even for those who can't access private care, advocate for support from your school.
I love it. I love it. If we're gonna go, but if you had one thing, just I always like to ask this, one bit of wisdom. If someone comes in and says, "I don't," I my child is straight A's forever, nothing is too challenging, but they're having these issues. I mean, how do I start? What's the first thing I
Yeah.
should do?
So I often say, stop shitting all over yourself.
I
So
love it.
that's where I start. Throw out any ideas of what your child should be doing based on what you know of their capabilities or what
Yeah.
you see peers doing, and really focus on what they can do and what they need support to do. So really get rid of those shoulds and really say it doesn't matter what should happen or shouldn't happen or what people believe should happen, and really just focus on what your individual child is showing you and telling you that they need.
That's a theme you've been talking about this whole time, and I really love
Indeed.
that. It's not a concept as much as it's a reality.
That's
So
exactly it. That's
I love
exactly
it.
it.
I love it.
Yes.
So before we go though, please, if someone does want to come to you, how can they get a hold of you? What are the good ways to get a hold of you?
Yes, thank you. So they can visit my website. It's drtamarasoles.com. And I have resources on there for parents, lots of free resources, downloadables as well as articles, like you mentioned, and also resources for therapists too. as well as a podcast with a ton of professionals that have been on talking about various related topics. So definitely they can check out my website, drtamarasoles.com.
I love it. I love it. Well, thank you, Tamara, for joining us
No,
today.
thank
Great
you.
insight on supporting your twice exceptional child. And what you did is you made it complex. It's a complex issue, but you made it
It is.
easy for me to understand, which, if I can understand it, you've done a great job.
I think you're underselling yourself there, but I appreciate the opportunity and it's always a fun chat with you. So thank you, Steve.
Well, thank you so much. And everyone else, thank you for joining us today. If anyone has questions on today's topic, you can also post it here and we can get you in contact with Tamara. So